Welcome back in. We mentioned the case in Maryland over automatic birthright citizenship earlier in the show. It's one of several percolating in the courts right now, almost certainly bound for the United States Supreme Court. The court has been pretty consistent on the topic, arguably. But is Trump banking on a change of heart, or rather a change of jurisprudence? We're going to bring in Amy Howe, who covers the court with ScotusBlog. As many of you know, so do I. And she's also with Howe on the court. She's written on what the court has said on this topic. This is almost certainly going up to the Supreme Court. Yes, I think it's really just a question of how quickly and from which of the many courts that are considering or have considered it so far. So give us the background. What has the court said? It hasn't come up that much, but right. So at least not lately. There is a case that deals with this specific provision of the 14th Amendment called United States versus Wong Kim Ark. And Wong Kim Ark was a man of Chinese descent, but born in the United States in the late 19th century to parents of Chinese descent. And he left to visit China. He came back to San Francisco, and the United States said, you know, you can't return to the United States because you are not a U.S. citizen. Right. And he said, well, I was born here. And the 14th Amendment to the Constitution says, you know, if you were born here and subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, you are a U.S. citizen. And the United States Supreme Court, the case made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which by a vote of 6-2 agreed with Wong Kim Ark that he was a U.S. citizen. There was a decision by Justice Horace Gray, and he said, yes, the 14th Amendment was originally intended to overturn one of the Supreme Court's most notorious decisions, an 1857 case called Dred Scott. And in that case, an enslaved person named Dred Scott was seeking his freedom, and the Supreme Court said that African Americans living in the United States were not U.S. citizens, right, and therefore not entitled to the protection of the federal courts. So the 14th Amendment was intended to overturn that ruling, but Justice Horace Gray said the 14th Amendment isn't limited by color or race. It applies to everyone who was born in the United States, that it affirms an ancient rule, he said. An ancient rule, right. It stems from long before even our country existed. We talked about on the show, you know, people have asked, how can the president in an executive order just change the Constitution? And we kind of explained it's not that he's overriding anything or rewriting anything. He's just saying this is our interpretation, and this interpretation has always been right. You guys have just gotten it wrong up until this point, and we're interpreting the language that's there to mean this. Do you think that that's one of the key arguments? I mean, can you count to 5 on that? That's exactly the argument. This phrase, this case, this dispute really hinges on the meaning of the phrase subject to the jurisdiction. And that was the argument that the dissent made in the Wong Kim Ark case. It was the Chief Justice at the time, Melville Fuller, said that Wong Kim Ark is not a U.S. citizen because he's not subject to the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court because his parents owed allegiance to the Emperor of China. You know, obviously the rest of his colleagues rejected that argument. They said he's a U.S. citizen because he was born here. But the Department of Justice is making a similar argument in these cases that are currently in district courts around the country, and the Justice Department has indicated that it is going to appeal the decision by U.S. District Judge Kuhnauer on Thursday to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. So that could be the first one to bubble up to the Supreme Court. Trump's order, which he signed on Inauguration Day, January 20th, is slated to go into effect in 30 days. So things could move relatively quickly. Yeah, we talked last week on the show about the language in the 14th Amendment subject to the jurisdiction thereof. One argument is that it's really about who you owe your political allegiance to, as you just said, versus are you subject to the laws of the United States? One of the issues that the lawyers that we spoke to representing the pregnant women in Maryland say this creates a problem of stateless babies, which is not an issue that came up the last time the Supreme Court had to do this because he already existed and was on Earth. We now have stateless babies, potentially, who have no political allegiance anywhere because, at least for some of them seeking asylum in the United States, they don't have political allegiance to their original home country. But if they can't have it here, You think that's a concern that will come up at oral argument? Have you seen it in any of the cases?
I mean, it certainly is a concern. In the Maryland case, there are, for example, plaintiffs who are from Russia and they are seeking asylum. They fear persecution, their lawyers say, from the Russian government.
Right.
And so, yes, they say our children could be born stateless.
Yeah. All right. The Ninth Circuit maybe is our way up. We'll see. We'll have to have you back when we make it to the court. And, of course, you'll be there.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thanks for joining us, Amy.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well.